Good evening, APUSH, and welcome to the Chapter 10 lecture. This is going to be about the 1790s and political turmoil that helps to create the first party system. And it's called the first because why? Because there will be a second, and then a third, and maybe a fourth and a fifth. Not quite sure, might have to check in on that, but there's definitely a first and a second that you need to know. So, let's go ahead and get started. In the spring of 1789, the new Congress began to assemble in New York City, which was the nation's temporary capital. Remember, it's not always been Washington, D.C. George Washington had been unanimously chosen as president, and John Adams was his vice president, although he was elected by a smaller vote. Washington sought to chart a middle course for the presidency. He wanted to balance the formality that he felt should be inherent in the office with the need to be something other than a monarch. He was called Mr. President, for example, rather than Your Highness. Washington was staunchly aware of the example that he was setting as the very first chief executive of the nation. Soon after the new Congress was elected, it enacted the Bill of Rights, which was 10 amendments that guaranteed certain rights. Remember that the Bill of Rights is something that Anti-Federalists had wanted in exchange for votes in favor of the Constitution. Initially, the House passed 17 amendments, but the Senate reduced those, eliminated 2, and combined the others to 12. In the end, 10 amendments became the Bill of Rights, minus the one setting the size of the House and one limiting congressional pay. That one was finally ratified, I think, in 1992. The First Amendment concerned the rights of RAPS, R-A-P-P-S, religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech. I would recommend memorizing those just for fun. Others had to do with rights relating to jury trials, quartering of soldiers, flashback to the last few chapters, right? Bearing arms, protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, and excessive bail. The 10th Amendment limited the powers of the national government also, stating that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Although the new national government was now stronger than it had been under the Articles of Confederation, it would operate within clear limits. The Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause, located in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, allows the government to do what it needs to do broadly to carry out its specific duties. This is kind of an important sidebar right here that we're at. Let's see. How that necessity is defined and defended varies based on political positioning and philosophy. Quick note about the Constitution here real fast too. There are loose interpretationists or loose constructionists. Those are mostly going to be the Federalists of the time, and they're more inclined to view the government's powers more broadly, asserting that if the Constitution doesn't say something is not okay for the government to do, then it's generally fine. Then there are strict interpretationists or strict constructionists. They are mostly the Anti-Federalists of the time, and they tend to view the federal government's powers as something much more limited in scope, and they tend to assert the government can't do something unless the Constitution explicitly states it. This tension between strict and loose constructionists is seen in such political debates as the ones over the Louisiana Purchase, where Thomas Jefferson is going to be more loose than strict for once in his life, and debates over the National Bank, which actually extend through Andrew Jackson's time in office through the 1830s. This is not going to be the only time that we talk about the National Bank. Let's go ahead and advance the slide. In the summer of 1789, the bulk of the problems that Washington faced had to do with the nation's perilous economic state. The problem of debt incurred during the Revolution had persisted. Many soldiers still had not been paid, and neither had creditors who had helped to support the nation during the war, including wealthy individuals as well as other nations. We are deeply in debt, folks. Individual states also had their own debts, which were in some cases pretty substantial. Some states had managed to pay off their debts, others still carried them. And there was no official currency. State governments, private banks, and Congress itself all had issued a variety of easily counterfeited paper notes. Congress adopted a tax on imports and created a system of federal courts. It also approved the establishment of 4 senior positions within the executive branch. We had the Secretaries of War, State, the Treasury, and an Attorney General. quick note too, the Constitution had really made no provision for a cabinet. It was just said that senior offices could provide the president advice, and writing it phrases it pretty broadly like that. This idea of a cabinet is something that is not inherently constitutional, but it's something that we've developed in practice, and Washington really helps to develop that. Jefferson was appointed the very first Secretary of State. Henry Knox was Secretary of War. Edmund Randolph was Attorney General, but it really was Washington's choice of Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury that would have the most far-reaching effects, some of which you've seen this week with your Hamilton footnotes. Let's go ahead and advance the slide. And of course that is Lin-Manuel Miranda, right down there, not the actual factual Hamilton. Close enough though, right? Let's go ahead and start talking about Hamilton's financial plan. In his first day, Hamilton negotiated a loan from the Bank of New York, set about creating the customs office to efficiently collect taxes on imports, and started to organize what would become the U.S. Coast Guard to curtail smuggling, or curtail, of course, meaning to cut short. That January, Hamilton delivered his Report on Public Credit. This is the first of 3 reports that you must know. You've got to know this, folks. Anyways, Report on Public Credit. This would provide the foundation for the economic development of the new nation. In this Report on Public Credit, Hamilton proposed that the national government should assume or take over all the Revolutionary War debt, both state debt and federal debt, and that the national government should pay those debts in full, rather than for pennies on the dollar, as some officials had proposed. Basically, we need to make good on our word. The national government needs to take over debt that we have outstanding from the Revolutionary War, and it needs to pay it off in full. Okay, talking about getting a good credit rating going here, folks. Now let's see. Indeed, some Revolutionary War veterans had been selling their promissory notes, basically notes promising they'd get paid. Some of them had been selling them for as little as 15 cents on the dollar, right? They're hard up for cash, or they thought their official payday would never come. This is the situation some of them were facing. Assumption, as this plan came to be known, would, Hamilton thought, create a strong connection between the federal government and its creditors, and it would give creditors and businessmen a stake in supporting the government's success, since if the government failed, then they would not be paid back. This is very important to note, folks. Hamilton thinks that maintaining some sort of federal public debt is a good thing. If we owe people money, those people are going to be invested in the success of the government, because if the government fails, these people ain't going to get their money back. Okay, this is a way for people to literally be invested in the success of the government, and Hamilton's plan, I think, is pretty well thought out. But not everybody in Congress is going to agree to this. Madison led the opposition in the House, while Jefferson quietly raised objections within the administration. States that had already paid off their war debts, states that had already been kind of responsible about it, they were pretty unhappy about paying taxes to bail out less responsible states, and they're certainly not happy about seeing neighboring states who maybe weren't quite so responsible just kind of get everything excused, right? And soldiers, those ones from earlier who had sold their promissory notes to who had sold out their promissory notes to kind of like bail themselves out of debt for less than face value of those notes, were angry at the thought that those who now held them would receive payment in full. So there's a lot of tensions going on here, folks. In the spring of 1790, the House rejected Hamilton's proposal 4 separate times. Finally, Jefferson and Hamilton struck a deal. Jefferson would withdraw his opposition to the Assumption Bill, allowing it to pass, and in return, the site of the nation's capital would be located further south. Agitation had already begun over moving the capital, which Southerners felt was too close to the anti-slavery tendencies of the North. In July, Congress made the compromise official, right? They got this 10 square mile site on the Potomac River, I think is how you say that, between Maryland and Virginia, designated as the nation's permanent capital. This way the South could, literally try to keep an eye on what's going on, right? In the meantime, the government would function from a new temporary capital in Philadelphia. This is, just to kind of go back real fast, This is one of several times that the nation compromised over tensions between the North and the South by relying on Virginia geopolitically. One previous example is when they chose a Virginian to lead the Continental Army, so the South would be less wary of all these Northerners banding together to go fight the Brits, and of course I'm talking about them choosing Washington right there. The split over economic policy led to the creation of two hostile political parties, something not accounted for by the framers of the Constitution. On the one hand, we got the Federalists, including Adams and Hamilton. They supported a strong national government, while their opponents, unofficially of course, led by Jefferson and Madison, came to be called the Democratic Republicans. To a degree, the political divisions reflected a sectional split, with the Federalists claiming support from bankers and merchants in the Northeast. Southern plantation owners and small-town merchants, farmers, people on the western frontier, tended to support the Democratic Republicans. Each side had its own fiercely partisan newspapers, like we see the Gazette of the United States being the foremost Federalist organ, and the National Gazette, edited by Philip Freneau, was the anti-Federalist mouthpiece. We got several different people on each side, and this really does characterize the 1790, right, the crystallization of both of these parties. Let's go ahead and advance the slide. In December of 1790, Hamilton issued another report to Congress, this one calling for a national bank. The Bank of the United States would function as a private and public partnership. Of course, the government would hold a majority stake. This would be modeled on the Bank of England. It would manage the economy, and it would fund a strong government. The Bank of the United States would issue banknotes that, unlike other paper currency from other sources, could be trusted since it was backed by the United States, who promised to redeem it in gold and silver. If you've got a dollar bill nearby you, take a look at it, right? That bill is legal tender for all debts, public and private. In a certain day and age, you could literally take it to a bank and be like, hey, I want $1 in gold, and they're supposed to be able to give that to you, right? And we'll talk about the gold standard and bimetallic currency and things like that kind of as we go forward. I'm thinking here of the progressives, I'm thinking here of Nixon, I'm thinking here of different conferences that kind of dealt with the gold standard, but we'll get to that in due time. But for now, understand that this is when paper currency backed by the government is established. And we also see this idea that it should be backed by, something. It's not backed just by full faith and credit in the U.S. government, right? It's backed by gold or silver, ideally, okay? Such a bank as the Bank of the United States could also make loans to fledgling businesses. It could ease the credit squeeze and stimulate commerce. Southern plantation owners like Madison and Jefferson resented the bank. They don't like it. They see in it the threat of centralizing power in the big northern cities. They also tended to distrust individuals who were not producers like themselves, but people who simply moved money around and made a profit from the production of others, right? In their view, if you're making money by, dealing with other people's money, that's not really honest in their view, and their followers, these other anti-federalists, are going to feel the same way. The Battle of the Bank revealed the extent of the divide between those who wanted an urban commercial nation and others who wanted a country of independent yeoman farmers. In the end, the Bank of the U.S. bill passed, with the vote clearly along sectional political lines. The bank would haunt the nation politically for decades to come. Then came the battle over whether Washington would sign the bill. Some, like Jefferson and Randolph, urged Washington to veto it, noting that there was nothing in the Constitution that authorized a federal bank. There's no article that's like, here's how you set up a bank, right? Hamilton and his supporters, though, argued that the Constitution actually empowered such a thing by virtue of the Necessary and Proper Clause. Remember, the Necessary and Proper Clause was intended to facilitate smooth functioning of the government. If you need to create something to fulfill constitutional duties, then go ahead and create that thing. And in their view, the bank would be such a thing, right? If you're going to do your constitutional duty, you gotta create a bank. So even if the Constitution doesn't talk about a bank, it kind of indicates that that would be okay. Does that make sense? Washington never explicitly took sides, but he was more inclined to be a Federalist, and he signed the bill. Hamilton also proposed a federal mint, and after that mint was established, he ended up actually resigning as Treasury Secretary. We're going to pause right there just so that I can upload the lecture in another chunk. Hang tight and I will be right back with you.